I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to Conversations with Al McFarlane, broadcasting from the Marcus Garvey House here in North Minneapolis. And you know, it's all about the neighborhood. This is a conversation about how we build our community, our neighborhood, house by house, family by family. We're focusing on business creation, business development, economic development, and culture. It's a wonderful conversation, a robust conversation. One of the guides for this conversation is my brother, who takes us on a musical journey, Wayne McFarlane and jazz. Check him out. I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to Conversations with Al McFarlane. Today's broadcast is created at the Minneapolis Urban League in North Minneapolis. Our topic today is voter registration, voter ID. I call it voter marginalization. A number of us are concerned that there are efforts to marginalize, to deprive a lot of people of the right to vote. Legislation, amendments are being proposed that will hamper access to the right to vote for a lot of people. We're talking about that today. It's not new. I think people will say that the great turnout to support President Obama in the last general election has created a backlash that intends to suppress the number of people that will vote to keep him in office for another 4 years. We're talking about that today. Let me begin by introducing Sunday Alabi. He's the Neighborhood Organizing for Change Executive Director or President. Sunday, good morning. Give us the background on voter suppression and the issue we're facing in the community today.
All right. I must say that almost 4 years ago today, the voter suppression started. But the people didn't notice because when we were registering people to vote in 2008, they were calling us that there was a voters fraud. Nobody has voted yet when they were saying voter fraud. If there's any fraud, it should be registration fraud. And then anybody you register, the person has to show up at the ballot box before you can say that they are not what would they say they are.
So people are going out registering people.
We were registering
There's
people.
no way of knowing exactly that the person is who she says she is or he.
Yes, right.
But it's not a problem until they show up.
Until they show up.
Okay.
And as far as we know, there's no, if there's any voter fraud, it's probably minimum.
So why is there a big issue? Why is the Republican Party in particular claiming that fraud is rampant and that the country has to be on guard and that states like Minnesota have to pass laws that make it more difficult for people to vote in order to prevent fraud? Why is that happening?
Well, you know, this is very interesting because in our community here, people don't vote because the politicians lie to us all the time. And people get tired of being lied to. People refuse to vote because they think their voter doesn't matter. But in 2008, when we had the issue that we know that this is a fight we can win, people went out to vote in large number. An election changed in 2008.
The president.
Of course, we elected President Obama to the office. Because of that, these people started 4 years ago. And if you notice, in so many states, they were passing this photo ID law in different ways. There's nothing more or less just to suppress the votes. No question about it. Everybody knows this because there was no voter fraud. Go and check. Anywhere you go, there's nobody who can tell you that some people register people with their first name. Anybody they register with their first name, none of them go to the poll to vote.
Let me bring in another voice. Kevin Lindsey is Commissioner for the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. Commissioner Lindsey, thank you for being here, first of all.
Thank you very much.
And from the state's point of view, what is being proposed? What has the Republican-controlled legislature presented to be on the ballot this fall?
You know, Al, I'll address that, but could I just pick up on what you said a little bit about the history? I think it's important to kind of put this issue in context within the United States history. So right after a period of time of what we refer to as Reconstruction, there was a significant number of African Americans that were elected to the House of Representatives and to the Senate. And it was a period of time in which we felt, as African Americans, that there might be an opportunity for us to gain a rightful place as American citizens. And at that point in time, a lot of laws were put on the books which took away the individual rights of African Americans to vote. Most prominently, this period is called the poll tax period. And sometimes people would be asked to pay a poll tax if they had a hue which was very similar to yours or to mine, but not for others. Or sometimes what states would do is they would ask certain questions, which if you had a PhD in 5 different categories, you might be able to answer. But for others, they might ask, does the sun come up every day? So states enacted these laws, put them on the books. And it's important to put this in context so when people hear the discussion about what Eric Holder is doing from the federal government perspective, they know the reason and rationale. Those states which had such onerous laws on the books, federal government came back around and said, you are denying the rights of African Americans to vote. So there were consent decrees by federal courts saying anytime that you want to modify or change your laws concerning voting, you have to come to the federal court to ascertain whether that's an impediment to the voting rights of African Americans. Now, let's flash forward. Just recently, what happened? A monumental event happened. We elected our first African American president.
Almost equivalent to emancipation, to a degree, in some minds.
Well, Alex, since you mentioned it, if you take a look at what happened concerning election laws, and a lot of the southern states in election laws dramatically changed. And one that I like to refer to is the idea of early voting. So in Georgia and Florida, they had laws in which we might hear a stirring sermon on the Sunday before election. There might be a bus which is outside, which we could go down immediately after the sermon and vote. After the election of our current president, those laws and that ability to engage in early voting was taken away. Now, one could ask, well, why would they take that away? And one has to ask the question, is there a connection between the history of Reconstruction and what just recently happened with federal elections? Are people concerned over the increasing number of members of the Congressional Black Caucus in the election of the United States president? So, to me, personally, when I look at sort of what is going on, it seems that we should be at a point in time in our country's history which we're talking about removing barriers to voting, not increasing barriers to voting. And I use this one about early voting because if you ask people their number one concern, they want to save money. Early voting saves money, okay? So, in the state of Minnesota, when we had a recount between Coleman and Franken in the United States senatorial election, a lot of money was spent, right, on these absentee ballots. So an absentee ballot comes in, there's 2 poll workers that have to verify on the outside of the ballot whether it has met all the requirements for being an absentee ballot. That requires payment of wages to those election officials. In an early voting system, you can go to the polling place several days ahead of the election, and not that this is a job creation issue, but you could put your vote into an electric machine, and it can then count the ballot. There's no additional cost. There's a cost savings to the system. So early voting, taken off the books in states which had an increase in the number of minority participation at a time in which we're trying to save money. Don't put additional barriers in. Increase opportunities for people to vote.
And so it comes down to interest. Whose interests are being served by decreasing the access to the polls by our people or any number of people that stand to be marginalized by the voter ID and other restrictions?
Well, it's just not us. This debate, this discussion reminds me of one of the quotes from Dr. King about stepping on someone instead of being into the ditch themselves. Because this is one of those situations where it could have unintended consequences and can take away the rights of others to vote. So, for example, if you are a military person and you are overseas, well, how are you going to show your photo identification card to an election official to be able to vote? If you are a college student and your address might be different than your driver's license, are you going to deprive those individuals potentially of the right to vote? If you are a poor person and you don't have the means to be able to drive and have a driver's license, are you going to have your right to vote taken away? In the state of Minnesota, 10 out of 11 individuals in the state of Minnesota right now, over 60, are Caucasian. One of the fastest growing population demographics in the state of Minnesota are individuals over 65. Now, I hope that they all stay healthy and live long, prosperous lives, but typically what happens once we get a little bit older, we decide not to drive. What is going to happen to those significant number of elderly people in the state of Minnesota? They're not going to have a photo ID. They're not going to be able to drive. And let me underscore this. Everybody under the 50, and I just barely under it, born in a hospital, kind of common. The first president of the United States to be born in a hospital is Jimmy Carter. That means there are a lot of people in the United States of America who were not born in a hospital. They weren't born in a hospital, don't have birth certificates. So once they give up that driver's license, what is that state-sanctioned identification going to be to allow them to vote? So this is kind of one of those situations. It's a human right for African Americans, and we can understand that history and tradition. But this is a human right. This is an American right. For the elderly, the poor, for military, for all. This is a cherished, important right. We need to be speaking out on this and ensuring that right for all.
I'm Al McFarlane. You're listening to Conversations with Al McFarlane. We'll take a break and come back and talk about solutions. I'm going to bring Nick Muhammad, who's a community organizer, Nick, and organization called Torchlight Minnesota. Also, I'll be presenting Executive Director of Take Action Minnesota, Dianne McGarth, talking about how we strategize to resist and respond. Stay tuned.
Africa.
Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. We're broadcasting from the Minneapolis Urban League in North Minneapolis. Our topic today is voter registration, or efforts to reduce, to marginalize some voters through the voter ID amendment. Now, that name is a common name, but there's a more proper name for the voter ID amendment in Minnesota. Dan McGarth, your executive director of Take Action Minnesota, what's the name of this legislation? And if you would, give statistics that sort of illuminate the issues already pointed out by Commissioner Lindsey.
Yes, absolutely. Just last week, Secretary of State Mark Ritchie changed the title of this amendment. That's something that's his legal authority to do, and he changed it to, and this is almost an exact quote, changes to in-person and absentee voting, voter registration, and provisional ballots. And the one thing the Secretary of State has done here is given a much more accurate title to what this measure is all about. It shouldn't go without stating that this is the most extreme form of voter restriction that's been proposed in the country. So in the last 2 years, only the last 2 years, 17 different states have passed voter restriction measures, which is phenomenal and speaks to what Sunday was saying about sort of this new national movement and national backlash that's been born to restrict the right to vote. A lot of that's about requiring a photo ID to cast a ballot. Mm-hmm. But I think what's important for members of the general public to understand is this is much, much more than the mechanics of voting. So it's true, 3 million eligible voters in Minnesota would now need to come up with a photo ID. But on top of that, we're talking about eliminating, flat out eliminating, Election Day registration. That's a system of voting that 500,000 Minnesotans use every presidential year. So think about that. 500,000 people can no longer get to the polls and register right then and there and vote. On top of that, it basically eliminates absentee voting, just like the commissioner had said. So folks who are defending our democracy overseas will suddenly lose their right to vote because the way this is written, folks need to provide substantially the same form of identification, whether they're voting by mail or voting in person. Well, how do you do that if you're serving our country in Afghanistan? Mm-hmm. Now, the last part is also very important to understand, which is this system, according to the Secretary of State, will cost upwards of $50 million every 2 years to implement. $50 million. We're a state that already has a deficit of what? I think it's $2.5 billion. We're going to be spending money to basically create a parallel system of voting in order to make all this work. So it has extraordinary ramifications, and let's keep in mind, right? Minnesota has the best voter turnout in the country, right? It's no accident that this is popping up here and popping up in other places across the country. Just one last point I'd make is that when we do talk about photo ID, it's not as simple or as benign as people might think. 25% of African Americans in this country do not have a current photo ID. That is the leading demographic category. It is no accident that the folks who are responding to the presidential election of 4 years ago are now putting these sorts of measures forward. And it's going to have tremendous impact. When you talk about what kind of state we want to live in, I really think this is a question that isn't just about whether or not you want to be able to vote or how it should happen. It's about what kind of state we want to live in. Do we want to live in a state that's just going to flat out exclude people from our democracy? Or are we going to welcome people in the way that this state has traditionally done and gotten better at doing, so that we're making decisions together that reflect what we all care about? So I'd say that.
Nick Muhammad, you represent, in my view, the hip-hop nation, the hip-hop generation, and you all turned out phenomenally in the last election. That group maybe is as much at risk of being marginalized as any other group. What do we do about this trend to take away the gains that have been made, that have been earned by people registering and voting? How do you respond to that?
Well, our response is to fight. We have to continue to secure our rights. Like, there's been a legacy that's gone before, not just the hip-hop generation, but largely in part the African-American community in general, in the struggle to secure the voting right. And one of the things I like to highlight is how they try to frame it in a way that we take something that we fought to have as a right, as a privilege, comparing it to something like a voter ID or a driver's license. Driving is a privilege, voting is a right. And we have to draw that distinction between the two and make sure that we highlight that so that the younger generation can actually understand what's at stake here.
Are people getting the message, though? I don't know that there's been this fire in the neighborhood. Are we understanding what's at stake?
Well, from my vantage point, we've been doing what we can, myself and other organizations and other community organizers, to make sure that we're voicing this opinion and starting up the conversation. People like yourself making sure that we're promoting this. One of the things that I do look forward to is some of the other organizations and foundations out here to put the funding behind the voter ID bill the way that, you know, the other amendments that are attacking other basic rights of our community and members of our community. But in the long run, I hope that we can garner those resources and get that funding going. But the main thing is to make sure that we begin to broadcast the message and encourage people to step up and secure that right and not let it slip through their fingers.
Dianne Binns is the first vice president for the St. Paul NAACP and chair of the Voter Registration Committee. Dianne, what are you doing to respond? What action are you taking in St. Paul?
Well, what we're doing currently in St. Paul is that we are holding educational forums for the community. And at those forums, we are informing them about what are the mechanics of voter ID, how it's going to affect them, the community, and also we're registering people to vote. And so we had a forum at the at William Mitchell Law School, and it was a great turnout. There were people there who were going to vote for this amendment but decided not to after they heard the presentation.
Did they say why they were going to vote for it?
Because they said that they believe that, and I think that's one of the misnomers in our community, is that everybody's concerned about voter fraud. There is no voter fraud. In my opinion, this is a solution looking for a problem. Mm-hmm. Because there's no voter fraud.
Enough, fraud. Everybody starts saying,
you believe that. Everybody will believe that.
Is it me?
Is it me?
You know,
right. They would believe
maybe I shouldn't vote.
That's
yeah,
right. And so what we're doing is doing the education, and for people, we also helping those. There was a 50-year-old man there who had never had a Minnesota ID. Now, I know some folks say, well, how do you do business? Because other forms of ID are acceptable. We're talking about everybody's going to have a state-issued ID, whereas banks and everybody else accept other forms of ID except state ID. This is going to be the one thing that will not happen. So we helped him get his Minnesota ID, and he was very proud of that. But what that entailed is that we had to send back to Indiana, get a birth certificate. We had to have 3 pieces of ID to show who he was. And what gives me a passion about this is that I'm one of those persons that wasn't born in a hospital. I was born on a reservation. And there was no birth certificate. I had to take my mother back to the state I was born in. And at that time, they were letting her verify that on my birthday, because nobody knew what day I was born except her and my family. Mm-hmm. And so I was able to get my identification. But now that wouldn't suffice after the Patriot Act. You can't do that. You got to have proof. You got to have at least 3 pieces of documentation to show who you are, because we are into this thing about stolen IDs and voter fraud. Voter fraud, by the way, in Minnesota and most of these states that has implemented this, is not a problem. And so we got a solution looking for a problem.
So Dan, why? What's the politics of this?
The politics. Go ahead.
Well, you first, and then Dan.
I feel the politics of this is Jim Crow all over again. I lived through Jim Crow. I used to watch my grandparents and my mother and them go to the polls.
Now there are some people who are listening that don't know what you mean by Jim Crow. So break it down.
Okay, racism, straight up, because at the polls, my neighbors who were white and poor like me had the power. I didn't have any. My parents didn't have any, my grandparents didn't have any, but they had a jar of jelly beans sitting up there. And I never forget, my grandfather didn't get to vote because he couldn't tell that man how many jelly beans was in that jar. And from state to state, you had those kind of laws in place. Or you had poll tax. A poll tax was, they tax you $5, $10. A lot of times it would be whatever the person sitting behind the desk thought that the poll tax should be. So, so those are the kind of things, that was the dark part of America that we lived through, that people fought for and died for us to have this right, because this is not a privilege. I mean, this is not a right. This is our privilege. It's a constitutional guarantee that we had because the Constitution was changed to make it possible for us to have this. This is a privilege. So this is not a right. And that's what this passion is for me, because I don't want to see us take those turns and do that again. That's where we're headed. And this starts in the South, but guess what? Things that started in the South also equals all the way up north and out west and east too. That's what happened with slavery. It started in the South, but it was still condoned, carried out all over the country. Because when masters left and brought their slaves up here, they still were slaves.
Dan, what do we do? What are the politics behind this, and how do we organize? And what is Take Action Minnesota doing to organize?
Yep. So I'll say I appreciate the commissioner's comments. There's one thing I would disagree with, which is that I don't think the consequences are unintended here. They are very much intended, and that it's important to understand, right, that this amendment impacts all of us. Any person who changes their address in September or October of an election year might lose the right to vote. Anyone who loses their wallet around Election Day loses the right to vote. Not to mention, right, all sorts of people who are pushed to the margins because of this extraordinary economy and recession we continue to be in. So I'll just say that I absolutely agree with that. I think this is Jim Crow under another name. I think it's also important to note, just how broad these ramifications are. My uncle was unemployed for 8 months last year. He is mad as hell about what this economy is doing to people. Well, people who profit from people being unemployed don't want him to vote, so they go after him, right? People who profit by disinvesting from our communities, they don't want those communities to vote. So it's not so subtle. Now, I think our job as organizers, and this is something that I think is on all of us, is we got to peel back the layers. Like, let's be really clear, right? The other side has been very, very good at making this sound like common sense. What's the big deal? It's a photo ID to vote.
Everybody wants honesty. Everybody wants to not be scammed by unscrupulous people.
You got it.
And so why are you objecting to people having to show an ID? That's
You
kind
got
of the really soft approach
That's
of the proponents of this amendment.
That's right. And so, I'll say, Take Action Minnesota is a community organization. We've been knocking on doors on photo ID for better than a year now. And our experience teaches us that, you got to sit down or talk to someone face to face and say, well, all right, let's think this through here, right? Why is it that this is coming before us? Photo ID to vote, okay, well, what about your grandma? What about your daughter in college? What about your neighbor who just lost his job? These are people who are impacted by this. You might have an ID today. Who's to say you're going to have it tomorrow or 15 years, whatever the case might be. So a lot of what our organizing has to do is both peel back the layers of this amendment and give these facts meaning, right? It can't just be a litany of let me tell you how many hundreds of thousands of people are going to be obstructed from registering to vote. Who are those people? What kind of state do we want to live in? Those are the sorts of conversations we need to be having with our neighbors. And more than anything else, we as a broad campaign, and so there's a broad campaign called Our Vote, Our Future. It's a big coalition that's been organizing on this. No one can be taken for granted. Not a single person in the state can be taken for granted. Everyone's got to be reached, talked to, and encouraged to get out there and vote no.
Dan, I don't think that we disagree.
I didn't think so, actually.
No, I don't think that we disagree. But I do think that the people who were trying to marginalize some are going to marginalize a lot more than what they initially.
I would agree with that.
And to Diane's point, and I know that you are sort of on this same, people need to know when people are talking about fraud, what they're talking about in the state of Minnesota, as someone who has litigated election law cases, they're talking about individuals who still need to satisfy the terms of their release from prison. They are not talking about an orchestrated process by which we try to elect Mr. McFarlane, where we all go out and find 10 of our friends and then make IDs and then fraudulently try to stuff the ballot box for our friend, Mr. McFarlane. No one is talking about that. That's not what they're talking about with fraud. And if that was going on, if that really was going on, then this would not be the solution to it. The solution to it would be to go and hire more prosecutors and then up the penalties for that type of behavior and conduct. And nowhere in this country is any state legislature doing that. What they're talking about is having someone, when you go to the polling place, review a photo identification card. You're not going to combat intentional fraud by doing that. And to suggest otherwise is just foolishness. and everyone knows that, who's over 21, who's gone to some adult place.
You better wait for it.
Right? Because there might be, right, a false identification card to get someone underage into that place. So no one can be honest, intellectually honest, and say that a photo identification card would solve intentional fraud in the voting system.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. We'll come back and talk more about the question of voter ID. I'm going to bring up Mona Langston. She's the outreach director for Minnesota's DFL, and she's going to talk about the question I've raised already. What's the politics behind this question? Also a columnist in Twin Cities and community organizer Mel Reeves. Others in the audience that will speak as well. Stay tuned.
It's all right. It's okay. It's so wonderful having a conversation today with all my friends, all my loved ones. We understand. Everybody say, we want to be dancing in the morning about 9 o'clock. We want to be moving and say it's your body will rock. Every time we talk about it and all the things we say, I want to live till the morning and live till the morning, live till the morning and play this old place where I'm going. This old town, tell me what I'm doing. This old place where I'm going. This old time, tell me what I'm doing. I just want to say, I just want to be with you in the morning. I'll share a cup of coffee and make a good one. Give you a little bit of weather, a little bit of that thing we say. Do all the things you know and do all the things you say, and I got a feeling that we're listening to this message today. I about you, you about me. Everybody say, I think about you, think about me, think about love. Music's so good, think about love. And I gotta love, think about things I say.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. We continue our discussion on the voter ID amendment. It's got a different name, but the issues are the same. I want to invite Mona Langston. She's outreach director for the Minnesota DFL to answer the question I posed earlier. What are the politics behind those who are driving this proposed amendment to our state constitution?
Well, absolutely. Thanks for having me. I won't repeat what all the panelists have said, but they were absolutely right. They've hit every nail on the head in terms of voter suppression, what this is going to mean to the voters in our community and communities across Minnesota, the folks who are going to be disenfranchised by this vote. And the politics, I think, is that exactly what we said. They're just simply afraid that they will have the turnout in the next election cycle that they had in 2008 and anything that they can do. You brought up a good point about the recount elections. Well, those margins were so close that if they can even get a few thousand people to not be able to vote because of this ID issue, that could very well make a difference in whether you get a Republican or a Democratic person in a particular position, not just in the state of Minnesota, but also at the federal level as well. And in politics, you know, we're partnering with as many folks as we can to educate people and to make sure that they understand that this isn't just about voter fraud. I think you're absolutely right, Commissioner. If you really think that this is going to stop voter fraud, the fraud doesn't start with the ID. The fraud starts long before that. And so this is just going to cost us millions of dollars to fix something that isn't broken, doesn't need to be fixed is strictly going to affect voters who have been disenfranchised most of their lives anyway, and further disenfranchise the next generations as well as the elderly generations. So there's a lot to do and a lot of
part
work
of the
to be done.
consequence of this debate is that people will be discouraged.
Yes.
People will be dissuaded from even stepping up because they'll feel that it's futile,
Yes.
that it's not worthwhile.
Well, yeah, and you know, there's so many more important issues that we should be dealing with in Minnesota and in our country. We have, you know, a job gap, we have an education gap, we have a health care gap. The state legislature this year spent more of their time as a Republican majority trying to suppress vote and take away rights and put into the Constitution, which is actually designed to give rights, something that would limit rights. This is something that...
So are the Republicans mean-spirited? Are they, what's driving it? I mean, they
I'll
see
let you use those words.
Well, they see themselves as decent, law-abiding citizens, and they see themselves as wanting the best for our state and for our country.
I wouldn't even pretend to try to get into the minds of those. I would say that from an outsider's perspective, they appear to be, they think that what they're doing is the right thing. I just think that they've used the wrong tool and the wrong avenue to try to do that. I think if we all sat down and talked about voter fraud in its real sense, we might find a different solution that isn't going to cost the state and the local governments millions and millions of dollars.
Thank you, Mona.
Thank you.
Commissioner, what about it? You mentioned the real fear is that people that had been disenfranchised because of criminal activity might vote, and then that's kind of what they really are trying to stop. Is that correct, or did I understand you wrong?
No, I think that is correct. I mean, if people are talking about ensuring that individuals who have not satisfied the terms of their probation and are still, as we call, on paper, then you can educate correction officers, you can educate those individuals to ensure that they do not go to vote. But let me say
And
two things.
how big a problem has that been?
Less than 0.02%.
Right. So I alluded to the fact that while I was at Ramsey County, I litigated a case on behalf of the county when they were challenged concerning the Coleman versus Franken senatorial election. So over 3 million votes are cast, and you have to go out 3 zeros and then add a number as relates to the number of ballots cast in that election in which someone who was still on paper voted. So it's infinitesimal, okay? So to that issue, Governor Dayton asked for an election integrity task force to be formed to communicate to those individuals so they do not commit what we define as election fraud under the law in that situation. But to that point, just 2 points, and if you have satisfied the terms of your release, your right to vote is restored. Let's be very clear on that. So once you have satisfied the terms of your release and you are no longer on paper, your right to vote is restored. The second point is, I think the election integrity task force, when I was there and participated, there was a gentleman from the Iowa election officials, and in his words, Republican, top official, having a photo identification, it will be obsolete by the time in which it gets implemented. So here he is telling the Election Integrity Task Force, do not come forth with a recommendation for photo identification because you are trying to implement an obsolete system from the inception.
Dan?
Yeah, just 2 points. One on that recount between Norm Coleman and Al Franken. You know, no one is more self-interested in discovering voter fraud than a candidate experiencing a recount. And Norm Coleman's own attorney, Fritz Kanak, said very publicly, he said, maybe it's the people, maybe it's the law, but there is no voter fraud in Minnesota. This is a man who's in charge of an operation of combing through literally every single ballot of 3 million cast to try to find a way for his candidate to win. The politics of this, you know, is both a U.S. Senate seat and a governorship, both up for election in 2014, 2 years from now, both of which were last decided by a recount. The last point I want to make is this. we do ourselves in this room and in this conversation no favors when we keep talking about voter fraud. You know, the only fraud that's actually being committed here is making it harder, if not impossible, for more than 700,000 eligible Minnesota voters to cast a ballot. Let's not play into the other side's trap, this red herring.
No,
you
what's
know.
700,000?
So we're saying, and this is again according to the Secretary of State, 500,000 people who use Election Day registration to turn out and vote, plus 215,000 who are currently eligible voters, people already casting a ballot, who don't have a current driver's license. That's according to the Secretary of State. Now, mind you, we're all impacted by this, but those are folks who are directly impacted. So I'd just say, right, that to me is a systemic effort to suppress the vote and ice people out of this, out of our democracy. That's unconscionable, and that's what we need to defeat. That to me is voter fraud.
Mel Reeves, question, comment?
Yeah, I think you were getting at the why earlier, the political piece in this. I mean, you know, we like to talk about having a democracy, but in reality we have a bourgeois democracy, right? Meaning that it's really more democratic among the folks who have money, the 1%, right? And we see that now with the slippery slope that we've gotten on with them being able to put more and more money into the elections, right? So, you know, if you got several million and I got $1, I think you're going to pay attention to what the person with several million. So we have this imbalance to begin with. And then this is part of a procession that we've seen by the ruling class in the sense that even I think the disenfranchisement of ex-felons, I think is problematic. I think that the rules in Minnesota are still too strict. What should happen is once you're released, you should be able to vote. Because we live in a society where there's an assumption, one person, one vote. Remember, we just celebrated a holiday in which folks fought about the idea of being able to be taxed, but not being represented. So this gets at the very heart of what we think is important as Americans. And they know that. This is a hole in their game, so to speak, because we actually can go to the polls and make some things happen really differently. You know, it's not just about, I think some people think it's about one party trying to make sure the other party doesn't get elected. I think it's even deeper than that. I think there's a futuristic piece of that because I think they realize at some point we're going to wake up to the game that they played on us, right? Because we've got this slavish dependence on both of the parties, and we keep coming back after voting and realize, man, the things that we thought they were going to do, they didn't do. And, you know, as long as I've been alive, we've been doing that game, right? But I think at some point, one of these generations is going to wake up and say, you know what? Let's vote for Sister Dianne Binns, because she said, hey, I'm going to fight. We're going to get some jobs. We're going to change some things for real. You know, we're going to end the system of mass incarceration. So folks are going to start coming up who are going to actually represent our interests, and I think they're afraid of that futuristically. I think that's the other piece of this, because you all have laid out the problem. I mean, and you're right, there's no fraud. I mean, I don't even have that discussion because it's not even real. There's no such thing as fraud. I mean, we saw this played out in 2000 election as well, and if you notice, the other candidate did not complain. I tell people that all the time. The other candidate did not complain about supposedly being ripped off. Now, you would think that he would complain, right? They told me that there's something else afoot here because, you know, there was some real voter fraud on the part of the people who were paid actually to oversee the thing. So that's my perspective. I think this is very political and that they really want to take away all our right to pretty much say what we want. And that voting is still a hole. It's still an opening for us to actually have real democracy, and that's why they're after it.
Okay. Sunday, what are we doing? What kind of actions are afoot now?
As I said earlier, you know, this thing is systematic. I mean, you know, it started 4 years ago. And I can tell you, I mean, I look at this thing from the prism of my community here. We registered in our low-income community over 48,000 people, new voters. We know for sure that helped to put Keith Ellison in office and Barack Obama in this state. And one thing I know for sure in this country is that once you start making changes, they notice you and they want to change they want to stop you from making those changes. And the thing I will tell you for sure is that for me, I know people die for this thing. I mean, people spill their blood to give us the right that we all enjoy today. The least I can do in this coming fight is to register people and make sure this voter ID doesn't come to pass. It's almost, I mean, unforgivable for anybody to let this happen. I mean, you know, I will make sure, I mean, and I tell you, if you live in North Minneapolis, I will be knocking on your door every day to make sure that you stop this
That's
fight.
the other thing. We have to organize. That's true.
Yes.
We really got to. We're kind of
We have
late on this thing. The truth be told, we're late on this, and I think we have to. And this gives us a chance to educate folks about why and voting is important all over again, right? And I like what somebody else said. You know, this thing also is taking up our time and our energy while we got all these other pressing concerns. So these folks are not dumb. I mean, you know, it's like we had to take a step back in order to go forward again. You know, it's like we thought we had solved this. We got the Voting Rights Act, and here we are talking about. I can't believe this in 2012. We're talking about, man, we got to secure the right to vote all over again.
Yeah.
You know, folks are barely eating in this neighborhood and they're not working, and all kind of stuff is going on. They're locking up folks, and we're back to that old issue we thought we covered.
Let me bring Al Flowers in. Al, good morning, and thank you for being here. Your comments, your observations.
I've been working on trying to figure out how to get our young people out to vote. I got my son back there, he's 19 years old, haven't voted, and trying to get him back to be a part of it. But I love that you're doing the forum, Al, because you're probably one of the only ones really trying to do the forums, to talk about voter ID. I'm real concerned with the organizations and what's their real goal. We could talk about voter ID here, but I know you're gonna have the marriage amendment coming up later. Mm-hmm. The marriage amendment was, they was talking about that a couple of years ago and saying they're gonna put it on there. The voter ID they just put on in May and put us at a disadvantage as far as getting this word out to our community. So, and now to fight through the political things that they're doing right now is very hard on the community. What I want to know, I was in the meetings, and Minnesota United was in at a couple of meetings I was at. Some of their top people were talking about if African Americans don't get out and vote, because they're concerned how we will vote, and if they don't get out and vote, then it was good for them, because that's good for them. If they do get out and vote, don't educate them on what it is, and because if you don't vote at all, it's a no vote for the marriage amendment. I'm concerned as a leader, as an activist in Minneapolis and Minnesota, the long fight I've been doing. I respect Dianne Binns and the NAACP in St. Paul, but this is what's happening. And then you get the organization. That's why I would like to know what the organizations stand, how much resources are they putting toward voter ID, because they got millions of dollars for the marriage amendment. And then when you start talking about voter ID, everybody is shriveling up. And that's what I came to the forums to. I thought the congressman or the rep would be here, and I'm going to ask him the same question. Mm-hmm. How are you going to help us in our community to get this word out to our community about voting, about being a part of it? But I'm concerned about the organizations that you got on the panel here. What's their stance on making sure that, because they say we in our community, mm-hmm. if we ask for resources to make sure we educate our community, we're begging. Mm-hmm. The African American, mm-hmm. only the African American community do they talk to like this and say and try to push us back to do this. So I'm concerned that I don't believe we fully represented through the organization that they have put the resources in their hands. So how are we going to get that back? And I hope this panel can tell me what they're going to do.
Well, let me start with the commissioner. First of all, it sounds like there are competing interests here. How would you describe that? On the one hand, if our community is supportive of is not supportive of the marriage amendment, right? But we want to vote. And some of the proponents, you're saying, of the amendment are suggesting that if we don't vote, that means we are not supporting the amendment, so they're discouraging us from voting. Right. It sounds like you're saying that.
Right. We can't have a different opinion from what they want us to have.
Commissioner, is that a quandary?
Not for me. For me, that's the richness of the democracy. I don't want to exclude that conversation. I want to engage in that conversation. So to the extent that there are some in the community that might want to vote yes on the other constitutional amendment, I want to engage in that conversation. I don't want them to vote yes. I'd want them to vote no. But I don't want to be in a position where I'm not going to educate a fellow citizen on an issue because I want to discourage them from participating in the democracy. So, and I'll just make it real plain. Yeah. This is one where the rules of the game matter. The other side, in my view, is really playing the game wrong for a democracy. And that really is to be educating all and trying to win over the hearts and minds of people.
Well,
They want
can I
to
just follow-
exclude people.
Sure, go ahead.
Can I
please.
follow up and
Please.
ask the
Got
commissioner?
less than a minute, but
Okay,
quickly.
a quick one. How do you get the, because some in our community are totally want to say it's between a man and a woman, marriage is, and how do you make sure that they don't get marginalized, being homophobic? If you see, just because you have a belief, and some is in the Bible, you got your belief. How can you, and so much money is against that side, how do you make sure that their beliefs is, I mean, you can have your own voice and your own right, but when you're going against money and power, like you're talking about the Republicans, the Democrats have the same kind of power in what they're doing to right now. This is happening right now in live.
Well, you're asking sort of a fundamental question as it relates to the democracy itself. And to me, the only way in which we truly have a vibrant democracy if we're willing to engage in that type of conversation. And just so that we're clear, when we started out with this democracy on about a vote, it was white males, but who had property. Just so that we're clear, it was a very small subset. And we have gone and increased the number of people. So yes, people of color, yes, women, right? They've also expanded it. And you know what has happened? We are the most vibrant country on the face of the planet. So to the idea that we want to retract from that and exclude people from having that conversation, I don't think that's the history I want to repeat. I want to create more rights for people. I want to have engaged democracy. I want that interchange between people, because at the end of the day, the arc of justice bends toward that. That's where I'm going.
And we're out of time. This was a great conversation. Commissioner, thank you so much. Thanks to Nick Muhammad, for community organizer, for your leadership, your work, helping put this together, Nick. Thank you so much. Thank to Sunday Alabi, who's with the neighborhood organizing for change. Dianne Binns, thank you. St. Paul NAACP. Mona Langston in our audience from the Minnesota DFL, the outreach director, and also thank you to Dan McGarth, executive director of Take Action Minnesota. The issue is important. Mel Reeves, thank you for being here and for your comments. The issue is important. We have to pay attention. We have to make our voices heard. And I think I agree with you completely, Commissioner. This is about more democracy, more conversation, more engagement, but it cannot be about any one of us deciding that we don't matter, that we don't count. It has to be about everybody insisting that his own, her own voice is important, and that the voice of every other human being is equally important, and for that we fight. Join me again next time for Conversations with Al McFarlane.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We got to say goodnight. We want to thank Al McFarlane for bringing us all those great words and all our lovely guests, all the guests in the house. Everything's good, you know. So I want y'all to tune in every Tuesday morning, right around 9 o'clock. Because we're going to play us a song. All the guests will be home. We'll be feeling like talking, have a robust conversation. All our guests in the house, 2 million people out there. I know you're listening on the internet. KFA High. Come on, listen to the show. Come on, Al McFarlane gonna let you know. Cause this thing he said, the message is clear. Everybody knows we gotta